A maid of a wealthy family has been constantly humiliated and belittled for years. But then, her son, tired of seeing his mother suffer, decides to take revenge. Lisa had always been a strong woman, even from a young age. She lost her parents as a child and had to learn to survive on her own, clinging to odd jobs that barely paid enough for a decent meal. Life always seemed to throw a new obstacle at her every turn, but Lisa carried within her a quiet determination, a desire to find something better, to have a decent life, even if it meant sacrificing her own dreams. It was in this setting that she met a man who, for a time, seemed to be a refuge amid the chaos. He came into her life with sweet words and promises of a future together, and Lisa, longing for affection and hope, allowed herself to be swept away. However, this glimpse of happiness quickly faded. When he found out Lisa was pregnant, he didn't hesitate to abandon her, disappearing without so much as a backward glance, as if his presence had never existed. It was from that moment that Lisa realized the world could be even crueler than she had imagined. Alone and without support, she found herself in despair. She had no family to turn to, no friends who could offer help. The responsibility of raising a child frightened her, but it also gave her a new strength. She felt that, somehow, she had to succeed so that her child would have a chance at a life different from the one she had lived. Determined to fight for him, she searched in every way for a means to support the baby growing in her womb. That's when she heard, through acquaintances, about a job opportunity in a grand mansion owned by a wealthy family that was always looking for employees to handle the household chores. The offer wasn't ideal, the pay was low, and the conditions were tough. But Lisa knew that at that moment, any opportunity was better than the nothing she had. She accepted the position, seeing it as a way to provide for her child and ensure they had a roof over their heads. From the start, Lisa threw herself completely into the work. She was the first to arrive and the last to leave, attending to every detail with an almost obsessive care. She cleaned the mansion with the same dedication she showed to James, her son, who was born healthy and was the only light in her life. Lisa did everything she could to ensure he lacked nothing, saving what she could and always putting the well-being of the boy before her own needs. In the mansion, however, the reality was quite different. Lisa was treated with coldness and disdain by her employers, who saw her as just another employee in their service, someone who would never be worthy of a respectful glance. Day after day, she faced insults and veiled humiliations, as if her presence was a constant reminder that, to that family, she was nothing more than an invisible and disposable figure. But Lisa endured it all in silence, knowing that her job was the only means of supporting James, and for him, she was willing to tolerate anything. What kept her going, day after day, was the vision of James growing up happy. At home, she always tried to create an environment of love and warmth, attempting to make up for every tear she swallowed in the mansion. She never let him know about the insults she suffered, always protecting him from the harsh truth of her reality. To James, Lisa was the loving mother who made him feel safe, and she was determined to maintain that illusion, no matter the cost. In the mansion, she swallowed the bitterness of insults and contempt, but at home, she let the hope blossom that one day, perhaps, all of this would make sense. On a day like any other, Lisa was in the mansion's kitchen, tending to her tasks as usual. It was a hot day, but that didn't matter to her as she worked in the stifling heat of the stove. She made sure that every dish was prepared to perfection, knowing that her employers were demanding. Every plate had to be flawless, and every utensil had to be in its right place. They didn't forgive mistakes, and Lisa knew all too well the price of a small error. That day, as she put the chicken in the oven, she heard the unmistakable sound of her employer, Mrs. Michelle, entering the kitchen. Her heart raced. She knew that sound rarely meant anything good. "Lisa! Lisa! What is this?" Mrs. Michelle shouted, holding a tablecloth in her hands, visibly irritated. Lisa quickly turned around, wiping her hands on her apron, and tried to keep her voice calm. "Ma'am, did something happen to the tablecloth?" she asked, trying to hide the tension in her voice. Mrs. Michelle shook the cloth right in front of Lisa's face, revealing a small stain that was barely noticeable. "You call this good work? I don't pay a maid to leave things in a deplorable state. Look at this mess. How dare you put a stained cloth on the dining table?" Lisa lowered her head, trying to find the right words, but her employer continued without giving her a chance to respond. "You're a disaster, Lisa. Useless. I don't know why I keep you here. Anyone else would do a better job. It's only out of pity that I let you stay. Have you ever seen anyone who can only serve and clean? But even then, you fail." With each word, Lisa felt the insults hit her like knives in her chest. She knew she couldn't respond. She always limited herself to listening without arguing, as she understood that any attempt at defense would only make things worse. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I will wash the tablecloth again and I promise this won't happen again," she said, her voice trembling. Mrs. Michelle laughed scornfully, a sound that echoed in the cold kitchen. "That's right, Lisa. Apologize. It's the only thing you know how to do right." And she turned, leaving the maid alone with tears welling up in her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. Later that same day, Lisa was scrubbing the floor of the grand hall, trying to get rid of a stain that seemed more stubborn than usual when James arrived to pick her up. He did this every day, coming back from work in his old car, parking at the mansion entrance, and waiting for his mother outside, always patient. But that afternoon, as he got out of the car, he noticed that the door to one of the halls was slightly ajar. Curious, he approached and looked through the crack. Inside the hall, he saw Mrs. Michelle approaching his mother once again, her face twisted with disdain. The scene unfolding before his eyes made his blood boil. Lisa was kneeling on the floor, gripping the sponge tightly, nearly tearing the cloth she was using to clean. "Lisa, the floor is still dirty. Can't you even do this right? You're useless. When are you going to learn to do a decent job? If you keep this up, I'll have to cut your pay. After all, why should I pay for poorly done work?" Still kneeling, Lisa tried to respond submissively, her voice low. I'm almost done, ma'am. Just one more minute, and it will be perfect, I promise." Mrs. Michelle huffed and crossed her arms, watching her with a superior look. "Perfect? I highly doubt it, Lisa. But I hope at least this time you don't embarrass me. You know I have important guests coming over tonight, and I don't want them to think my house is as messy as where you came from." Hearing this, James felt a knot tighten in his throat. He stood frozen for a few moments, watching his mother bent over in front of Mrs. Michelle, submissive, so different from the strong image he had of her at home. That scene seemed to break something inside him, a thread that had kept his patience intact. Until then, Lisa had always shielded him from the reality. She never spoke ill of her employers, never complained about the difficulties of the job, and James believed that, despite the effort, his mother was in a safe place. But here, he saw the raw truth for the first time. "You're an embarrassment, Mrs. Michelle continued, her voice echoing in the empty hall. "Do you think you're doing me a favor by working here? You should feel grateful that I'm generous enough to keep you in this job. Don't forget you could be starving right now, Lisa. So keep your head down and do your work, because that's all you have left." James clenched his fists, feeling the rage rise in his throat. He wanted to storm into that room and shout, to defend his mother, but he held back. He stayed there in the shadows, listening as Mrs. Michelle left the hall, leaving Lisa behind, still kneeling on the floor. When he finally gathered the courage to enter, Lisa saw him and tried to hide her tear-streaked face, quickly wiping her eyes with her uniform sleeve. "James, what are you doing here, son? I thought you were at work." "I came back early, Mom," he replied, his voice trembling with restrained anger. He looked at her, trying to understand why she put up with this in silence. I saw what that woman said to you. How can you stand this?" Lisa tried to smile, a weak, forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's nothing, my son. Don't worry about it. They are just difficult people. It's part of the job. And the important thing is that we're okay, right? I do this for us." James stepped closer and held her by the shoulders, feeling his heart weigh heavy seeing the pain in his mother's eyes. "Mom, this isn't fair. They have no right to treat you like that. You don't deserve to hear those things. Nobody does." She stroked her son's face, trying to convey a calmness she didn't feel. "Don't think about it, James. I just want you to have a better life than mine. Nothing else matters. Please leave this stuff behind." But James couldn't let it go. Mrs. Michelle's words echoed in his mind, blending with his mother's pained look. He felt something growing inside him, a feeling he didn't recognize, a mix of helplessness and hatred that was eating away at him from the inside. The next morning, James woke up early but couldn't shake off the weight he felt in his chest. Mrs. Michelle's words still echoed in his mind. Lisa's tired face, the way she hid her tears, it all replayed in his head over and over again. As he quietly ate breakfast, he glanced at his mother, who was already getting ready for work, as always. She didn't mention the humiliation from the day before, as if she wanted to pretend it had never happened. But James couldn't ignore it. "Today I'll drive you to work, Mom," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I want to talk a bit with you on the way." Lisa simply nodded, knowing it was pointless to try to dissuade him. James drove her in his old car, the same as always, but during the ride, he couldn't help but let thoughts of revenge grow in his mind. When they arrived at the mansion, he said goodbye to his mother, and as he watched her disappear through the door, he made a decision: this would be the start of a new path. He could no longer watch her suffer in silence. On his way back home, he grabbed the laptop he kept under his bed and began researching the companies owned by the family that employed his mother. He found an opportunity in one of the smaller subsidiaries, a logistics company that managed part of the local business. He knew that if he could get a position there, he could infiltrate and start to devise his plan. A few days later, with his resume polished and a carefully crafted appearance to look more formal and confident, he went to the company headquarters to apply for a position. Upon arrival, he was greeted by a well-dressed middle-aged man with a skeptical look. His name was Anthony, one of the human resources managers. "Good morning, my name is James," he said, extending his hand with a polite smile. "I heard you have an open position, and I believe I have the necessary qualifications." Anthony looked James up and down, sizing him up with a skeptical air. "Your resume says you have logistics experience, but I see you've worked at small companies. Why do you think you'd be a good fit for us?" James kept his tone steady, not wavering. "Exactly because of that, sir. I'm well aware of the challenges in the local market, and I know how to find creative solutions to problems that many ignore. Plus, I have some interesting contacts in the field. I think I could bring new business opportunities to you." Anthony raised an eyebrow, intrigued by James's confidence. After a moment of reflection, he gave a half-smile. "I'll give you a chance, kid. You can start next week. But I want to see if your words match what you can actually deliver." "You won't regret it, sir," James said, shaking Anthony's hand firmly. The following week, James started his new job, and as promised, he presented himself impeccably, quickly earning the trust of some colleagues. Within a few months, he had built a reputation as a competent and ambitious person. It was during this time that he initiated the next phase of his plan. On an ordinary afternoon, after work, James met with Joseph, a young man working in the accounting department. "Joseph, I need your help with a little problem," James began casually. "I'm trying to understand some of the company's financial reports. You know I'm new here, but I'm interested in deepening my knowledge. Who knows, I might even suggest improvements to our processes." Joseph, who already considered James a friend, smiled, pleased with his interest. "Of course, James. I can show you how it works. I think you'll enjoy understanding the cash flows and transactions. We always need someone with a fresh perspective." As Joseph showed him the reports, James paid close attention to every detail. Within a few weeks, he already understood how the accounts control system worked. He then began to divert small amounts to accounts he had created, with names that sounded like legitimate suppliers. At first, no one noticed the discrepancies since they were small amounts and the records seemed perfectly normal. But James knew he was just getting started. At the same time, he began attending industry events, pretending to be an influential businessman. For this, he bought a used but stylish suit and took care of every detail of his appearance. At one of these events, he met Christopher, a businessman involved in international transport. "Christopher, I've heard great things about your business." "My name is James, I work in logistics and am always looking for new partners," he said, extending his hand confidently. Christopher shook James's hand, smiling with interest. "Nice to meet you, James. I don't remember us having met before. Are you new in the field?" "Let's just say yes," James replied, laughing lightly. "I've been focused on understanding the market and seeking expansion opportunities. And I know my employers don't mind investing as long as there's a good return." Christopher seemed impressed by James's boldness. "I like ambitious men. Maybe we can discuss this further over dinner to talk business." "It would be a pleasure, Christopher," James replied, already starting to weave his network of contacts. He knew that by gaining the trust of businessmen like Christopher, he could undermine the relationships his employers had in the market. So, every move was calculated, and every conversation was another piece in his plan for destruction. At the office, James also started to get closer to Olivia, the director's secretary. He approached her with a respectful and helpful attitude, always offering assistance whenever she needed anything. "Olivia, it looks like you're swamped again today. Do you need me to take these documents to the boss?" James said with a friendly smile. Olivia sighed in relief. "Thanks, James, you're always an angel. If you could, please take these contracts for Mr. Robert to review. He's been more demanding than usual." As he carried the documents, James quickly skimmed through the papers, analyzing the contracts before handing them over. He mentally noted the weaknesses and identified areas he could manipulate. It didn't take long for him to start influencing small decisions, always subtly diverting his superior's attention while undermining the client's trust. Every step he took brought him closer to his ultimate goal. James acted with patience and coldness, observing the reactions of his mother's employers without revealing what he was truly planning. It was a game of chess, and he was determined to win. He knew the right moment to act was yet to come, but he needed to gain ground first. So, he continued to build his network of contacts, presenting himself as someone with ambitions greater than they imagined. Weeks passed, and James began to feel the tension rising in the company. Director Mr. Robert was increasingly worried about falling revenues and the loss of some important contracts, but he had no idea that one of his own employees was behind the emerging problems. Meanwhile, James was preparing to take the next step in his plan. He awaited the gala dinner that his mother's employers organized every year, an important event where all the family's allies and friends would be present. He knew that this would be the perfect moment to reveal his true face and deliver the final blow, but he still needed to wait and carefully plan every detail. The night of the gala arrived. The mansion was impeccably decorated, with golden lights illuminating the gardens and halls, and the soft music of a string quartet filling the air. Guests began to arrive, dressed in their finest attire, and were greeted with smiles and glasses of champagne by the hosts, the very same people Lisa served obediently. The family was eager for the night, a traditional event where they displayed their power and influence. Lisa was there, as always, in the back of the kitchen, ensuring everything met Mrs. Michelle's demanding standards. She organized trays, adjusted glasses, and instructed the waiters, while trying to ignore the memories of daily humiliations. This time, however, there was a shadow of worry in her eyes, as James was also present at the event, in one of the roles he had taken on as part of his plan. James, on the other hand, was ready. Dressed in a simple yet elegant black suit, he blended in with the guests without drawing attention, waiting for the right moment to act. With each step he took between the tables, he observed the haughty faces of the hosts, who spoke to their guests as if they owned the world. He kept a cold smile on his lips, knowing the night would take an unexpected turn. At one point, while the guests were enjoying the served dishes and toasting with glasses, James approached Mrs. Michelle and her husband, Mr. Donald, who were animatedly conversing with other businesspeople. He politely but firmly interrupted their conversation. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I have an important revelation to make tonight," James said, his voice laden with false cordiality. Mr. Donald frowned, visibly displeased by the interruption. "And who are you to interrupt our guests like this? We're in the middle of an important conversation." James kept a smile on his lips, but his gaze was relentless. "Oh, I'm just someone you underestimated. Someone you never imagined could bring you a little surprise." He made a sweeping gesture with his hand, catching the attention of everyone around. Murmurs among the guests began to rise as they turned to look at him. Mrs. Michelle, trying to maintain her composure, forced a smile. "Oh, what kind of joke is this, young man? We don't want to ruin the night with your nonsense." James let out a dry laugh. "This isn't a joke, ma'am. In fact, it's about business. Let's talk about the company's situation, shall we? I believe many of those present here will be surprised by some information I've gathered." Mr. Donald attempted to cut off the conversation, gesturing impatiently. "If there's a problem, we can sort this out later. This is not the appropriate occasion." But James wasn't intimidated, and with a sudden gesture, he drew attention to a screen that had been set up in the hall to show a video. "Actually, I think this is precisely the appropriate occasion, Mr. Donald. Guests, please, I ask that you pay attention. What I'm about to show is very important." With a command, the lights in the hall dimmed partially, and the projector illuminated the screen. Financial documents, graphs, and emails that James had carefully manipulated appeared. The fraudulent transactions he had forged came to life in detail, showing money being diverted and indicating the company's impending bankruptcy. James looked directly at Mr. Donald and Mrs. Michelle as the color drained from their faces, trying to process what they were seeing. "What is this? Is this some kind of trick?" Mr. Donald asked, his voice trembling with anger and fear. He looked at the guests, who were now murmuring and whispering among themselves, while some began to look at the family with suspicion. "This, Mr. Donald, is proof that your company is on the brink of ruin," James replied, his tone unforgiving. "Thanks to some poor decisions, let's say, your business is compromised. And you know what's even more interesting? No one else would trust you with their money after today." Mrs. Michelle lost her patience and stepped forward, trying to assert her presence. "How dare you do this? Who do you think you are? We won't allow some kid to destroy our reputation like this." James turned to her, his smile completely fading, replaced by a look of pure contempt. "Who am I, ma'am? I'm the son of the woman you humiliated for years. I'm the one you treated like nothing while my mother scrubbed the floors for your feet to walk on. You thought I was invisible, but I was watching every word of disdain, every time you treated her like trash." A heavy silence fell over the hall, broken only by the low sound of the guests' quickened breathing. James stepped forward, staring Mr. Donald directly in the eye. "You underestimated the wrong person. While you smiled and pretended to be superior, I learned everything I needed to destroy you. And today, in front of all your friends, I'm determined to show who you really are, a bankrupt family that built its empire on the suffering of others." Mr. Donald tried to react, his face flushed with shame and anger. "This is a lie. He's making all of this up. You can't believe this kid." But James didn't back down. He pointed to the screen, where more evidence flashed, showing messages from business allies who were now turning their backs on the family. "No, Mr. Donald, this is very real. You've already lost important contracts and no longer have the market's trust. All thanks to me, and your own greed." With every word James spoke, the confidence of the hosts crumbled. Mrs. Michelle looked around, seeking support among the faces of the guests, but all she found were looks of disapproval and shock. She tried to step towards James, but her voice failed her. You're a monster. We helped your mother, we gave her a job. And this is how you repay us?" James laughed bitterly, his expression hardening. "You gave her a job? No. You gave her humiliation, disrespect, made her believe she was less than human. The only thing you gave her were years of suffering. But now, look at you. Do you feel powerful now? Because all I see is a family that's lost its footing." Mrs. Michelle began to cry, but her tears stirred no compassion in James. He turned to the guests, who now regarded him with a mix of respect and fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, the truth always comes to light. And today, you've seen who the real hosts of this dinner are. I just regret that it took so long for this to come out." With one last look of disdain, James stepped away from the screen and walked towards the exit. The hall was steeped in an awkward silence as the guests exchanged nervous glances, some already hastily leaving the event. Mr. Donald, with trembling hands, tried to compose himself, but the shame was evident on his face. Mrs. Michelle sank into a chair, powerless to face the piercing gazes. Before walking out the door, James turned one last time. "And know this, everything you have now is what you deserve. I hope you remember this night for a long time. And that, perhaps, for a moment, you think about all the times my mother apologized while you looked down on her. Goodbye." James left the mansion, leaving behind the chaos he had created. When he reached the car, he found Lisa waiting on the sidewalk, her eyes still wide with surprise from everything she had heard. She tried to speak, but he interrupted her, holding her hands gently. "Let's go home, Mom. We don't have to come back to this place anymore." She nodded, a mix of relief and sadness filling her heart. James knew he had achieved the revenge he had long desired, but looking at his mother's tired face, he realized that the justice he sought wouldn't erase the years of pain she had endured. They got into the car and drove away, leaving the mansion and their former employers behind, now stripped of their arrogance and power. The wealthy family that had once trampled over Lisa had become nothing but a shadow, a bitter memory in the city, associated with failure and shame. The fallout from the gala dinner was immediate and devastating. In the following days, local newspapers and news websites carried scandalous headlines, detailing the fraudulent transactions and the impending bankruptcy of the company that had once been a symbol of prestige. Reporters camped outside the mansion, capturing images of Mr. Donald and Mrs. Michelle rushing out, trying to evade uncomfortable questions. With contracts terminated and business partners quickly distancing themselves, the family had no choice but to sell the mansion and other luxury assets to try to cover some of the debts that were now suffocating them. The cars, the jewelry, the properties, everything was auctioned off to pay for the broken contracts and the debts that piled up each day. But even with their desperate efforts, bankruptcy was inevitable. The once grand home that had hosted so many parties and events was now just another property on a list of assets they had lost. On the day they prepared to leave the mansion for the last time, stacking boxes of personal belongings onto the moving truck, Mr. Donald's face was haggard, his shoulders hunched under the weight of shame. Mrs. Michelle, her face swollen from crying, watched the house being emptied, each piece of furniture leaving like a part of a life she never believed she would lose. It was at that moment that James appeared, standing across the street, watching the scene with an impassive expression. Dressed simply but standing tall, he waited in silence as the eyes of his former employers finally noticed him. Mr. Donald clenched his fists but found no strength to react. However, Mrs. Michelle, driven by a remnants of fury and wounded pride, approached him with quick steps. "Are you happy now, you worm?" she shouted, her voice filled with hatred and desperation. "You destroyed our lives, our family. This is all your fault." James looked at her, unyielding, and waited for the silence between them to be filled by the final slam of the closing gate. "I'm just here to see your end," he replied, his voice low and cutting. "To witness the suffering of filthy people like you. I wanted you to feel what my mother felt, I wanted you to know what it's like to lose everything. And now you do. Enjoy your new life, Mrs. Michelle. I'm sure it will be much more simple." He turned his back before she could respond, walking slowly to his car as the former owners of the mansion watched him leave with expressions of despair and defeat. The gate of the mansion closed behind Michelle and Donald, marking the final point in the story of power and arrogance they had built. For James, the satisfaction of witnessing that scene was bitter. He knew he had returned to them the suffering they had inflicted on his mother, but the victory wasn't as sweet as he had imagined. When he returned home that night, he found Lisa in the living room, staring at an old photo of James as a child, her gaze distant. "Mom, they lost everything," he said, trying to find some comfort in that fact. Lisa merely smiled, a sad smile that barely touched her lips. "Losing everything isn't as hard as surviving when you've never had anything, my son. But if this brings you peace, then let's move on and leave the past behind." And so, mother and son buried the past in the ruins of a mansion that no longer cast its shadow over them. The city changed, just as they had changed, and while the former employers faced the reality of their ruin, Lisa and James moved forward, heads held high. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.